Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. Welcome to today's analysis for 10th of November 2023, where we will be trying to understand the most important articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express. Looking at the very first article, it is about carbon emission and how it is related to GDP. Next, we'll be trying to understand what are criminals and what are their role in our Indian politics. Then we will be trying to understand the 2+2 dialogue that is taking place between US and India. Then we will be trying to understand what are the various sessions of our parliament with reference to the recent winter session of the parliament. And finally, we will be concluding the discussion with the inflation scenario in India. Coming to the very first article, it is about a statement that is coming from the RBI Deputy Governor. He is telling that absolute decoupling is yet to happen between carbon emissions and GDP growth. Now this is very important statement because we have to understand from the context of our syllabus. We have in GS3 Indian economy and the various issues related to that, and also conservation and environmental pollution. Now we have to understand that in mains often what UPSC does, it will be merging the concepts from say economics and say environment, and they can frame questions based on both topics, and this is a very good topic with respect to that. Now here we have to understand how are environmental concerns related with economic concerns here. Now before that, let me take you through some data and some economic theories before. Now see, when we will be comparing the amount of environmental degradation, we generally do that in terms of carbon dioxide emissions or CO2 emissions. So taking some few countries and their environmental degradation timelines in reference, we are taking say the UK, the United States, China, India, France, Germany. From here we can understand that countries like UK, US, France and Germany, these are developed countries, and if we can trace back their developmental stages, we can trace back to around 1750s. Back at that time the industrial revolution just took place, and from then only we can understand from the various graphs that the developed countries, especially the United Kingdom and the US, they started emitting more and more carbon dioxide because industrial progress, industrial development will be consuming more and more carbon footprint. So we can understand both the production and the consumption based CO2, or say the production side from where the carbon dioxide is produced more, and also the consumer side from consumers like us, people like us who consume day-to-day products. So we can see in the developed cases, in the developed country cases, even in the case of France and Germany, we can see that their developmental stages came with more and more cases of carbon dioxide emissions, because here on x-axis we have time or say years, and on the y-axis we have the carbon dioxide emissions. So we can understand a very clear and distinct thing here, that the developed countries are producing more and more carbon dioxide, and the bulk of their production of carbon dioxide were in the phases of 1850 to around 1970s. From 1970s, their carbon dioxide emissions started to decline because they have reached their stage of development. But when we look at the case of China and India, we can see from 1750 to around 1950s, you can see the CO2 emission is often negligible in both cases of China and India. These are developing countries who attained their independence, who were former colonies, and who started their development until recently in the say 1960s, 1970s, when the development started to pace. So in these two cases, in these developing countries, we are seeing that the carbon dioxide emissions are increasing over a period of time, and it is even increasing right now. So we can understand historically that developed countries contributed to a huge chunk of carbon dioxide pollution. Now, right now, the developing countries are making progress here. Now we have to understand what is the correlation between CO2 and GDP. Now here, there is a very famous environmental Kuznets curve, which says that the level of environmental degradation, if we take on the y-axis, and the GDP per capita if we take on x-axis, these two are in an inverted U format. That means at early stages of development, or when the GDP per capita is very low, there is very low level of environmental degradation, as was seen in the case of India here and China here too, right? But as and when societies or countries become developed, or when countries go from pre-industrial economies to industrial economies, so when India is right now developing, China is right now developing, that is why they are increasing their pollution of CO2 and say lot of other pollutants. And from here we can understand countries like the US, France, Germany, the UK, they are now decreasing their amount of carbon dioxide pollution because they have achieved that level of development, and also we can understand they are even high per capita income nations, and that is why their emissions are decreasing over a period of time. So we can get a inverted U kind of curve when it comes to the environmental pollution and GDP growth. So this is the correlation between the CO2 and the GDP of any particular nation, right? And is there any scope here how the amount of economic development and amount of environmental pollution can be separated? Or say, can we say that in the near future, when we will be progressing to cleaner and greener say sources of energy, can it be the case that the economic growth that will be taking place then will be totally separated from the amount of carbon dioxide generated? Because this is a question that is being asked by most of the policymakers right now, because the future, we are envisioning a very clean and green future, right? Now also there is a report coming from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that every 1% increase in GDP leads to 0.5% increase in carbon dioxide emissions. And this is in the case of pre-industrial nations and industrial nations, where the amount of industrialization is very much dependent on say fossil fuels consumption. So that is a very serious thing, that every 1% increase in GDP leads to slightly less increase than the carbon dioxide emissions. Then we have to understand why this is the case. Because we have to understand, since industrial nations are dependent on fossil fuel energy consumption such as transportation, heating and cooling requirements, they need to burn more and more fossil fuels. So that is why increased energy consumption, and also there is increasing population pressure. So this is leading to more and more carbon dioxide with more and more development. Then there is also increasing amount of deforestation, or the decrease in amount of carbon sink, or the areas where carbon dioxide is actually taken in from the atmosphere. Due to deforestation, more and more trees are being cut for agricultural activities, mining activities, infrastructural development activities, setting up more and more new industries. So these are also hitting and impacting this development. Next, industrial processes. This is increasing the amount of pollutants in the atmosphere and also driving the impact of climate change. So more and more industrialization is also increasing the amount of carbon dioxide emissions, right? And this can be perfectly summed up in this figure. If we can see, this is the case of energy poverty, where countries like say Pakistan, India, Tanzania, most of the say East African nations and some of the Latin American nations also, they are seeing very low amount of per capita income, while also very low on their CO2 emissions, right? But they are having this energy poverty, correct? Then there are these countries where emissions are too high, and here there will be developed nations like Switzerland, Canada, US, Singapore, Japan, right? And also some advanced developing countries also, even China, Mexico. So these are the nations with high amount of CO2 because they are seeing an increased amount of these activities. So this is a very serious area of concern, right? Because these have serious impacts. The very first impact is in the case of adverse weather events, such as the amount of sea level rise, such as the amount of increased natural disasters such as heat waves, such as landslides, such as flooding. So these are increasing over a period of time, as we can see, right? So these are some adverse weather events that is impacting the world over, and these are also leading to various supply shocks and demand shocks. Supply shocks are related to producers who are being impacted by these big events such as, say, a supermassive hurricane, a supermassive cyclone. When it impacts a particular country, their entire production process will be at a standstill. Then also demand shocks are there. In the same events of any natural disaster, or say human made disaster, there are people who suffer at the very bottom level, and their demand skyrockets in the cases of natural disasters, right? So we can understand, we can imagine a situation where due to more and more CO2 emissions, the world is going through various adverse weather events, and these are leading to demand and supply shocks. Next, these are also putting pressure on financial institutions and banks. How? Because these are the institutions who will be financing, or say giving money to various projects, to various businesses, right? And if the entire economy, or say most of the economies in the world, are facing issues related to climate change, then these banks, these institutions will not be able to lend money, because banks are generally risk averse due to some particular conditions. So that is why the banks and the financial institutions, they are also wary of these particular events. Now here the RBI deputy governor is telling that most of the central banks, while they are quite limited in their capabilities to combat climate change, they must also be contributing to the same, because generally it is the government, or say government through its fiscal policies, they combat the climate change imperatives. But here the central banks also have sometimes enough tools and enough advisory power on their own to bring on the challenge of climate change. Here we will be looking at some of the main RBI developments, or Reserve Bank of India developments, which they have taken in sustainable finance, that will be paving the way towards lowering the carbon dioxide emissions in the financial arena. Now, they started their first sustainable practices in 2007, when RBI released a report known as the Corporate Social Responsibility, Sustainable Development and Non-Financial Reporting and Role of Banks. So here in this report, RBI expressed how the banks can lead to sustainable development through transparent financial reporting. Next, in 2015, the priority sector lending, or these are various sectors of, say, Indian economy which need funds, right? For example, say poor farmers, say women, say startups, and even loan for renewable energy. So these are some sectors who need fund, right? And in 2015, RBI said that renewable energy sector is also eligible for priority lending, right? So that is why it is also a very good initiative. Next, in 2021, RBI joined the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a network of more than 100 central banks all over the world, and also various financial corporations, which will be looking at the various ways in which climate finance must be pioneered by a financial institutions such as banks and also central banks. So RBI joined it. Next, in 2022, RBI conducted a survey on climate risk and sustainable finance to assess the status of climate risk and sustainable finance in the lending activities of commercial banks in India. It will be looking in many ways, how the scheduled commercial banks in India are lending to green projects, such as setting up solar power plants and various other green projects. Next, in 2023, right, RBI announced the sovereign green bonds. Now green bonds will be investing in green projects, right? Green projects can be setting up wind farms, solar farms, right? So it will be about generating green energy, and it released around $2.2 billion on green bonds here. It is a very interesting development. And finally, also in April 2023, RBI introduced a framework for acceptance of green deposits. Now we have to understand that when we deposit money in our bank, the bank will be not keeping it with bank itself, right? It will be lending out to businesses. Now, under green deposits, the bank customers, or say the people like us, will be very glad to know that if we deposit in green deposits in any bank, the bank will be using our deposits to fund or say give loan to only businesses that invest in green projects. So RBI, in its own capacity, while it is limited, it is not having that much of capacity such as the government of India, right? But in its own capacity, it is trying to do as much as it can with reference to green infrastructure and reducing the amount of CO2. While at the government side, we have to understand that the government of India had its various green commitments under the Panchamrit. So the government of India is trying to diversify its green portfolio via these 5 ways. The first is about achieving around 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel energy capacity by 2030. Then it is also trying to achieve 50% of energy from renewable sources by 2030. Then it is also aiming to reduce carbon emissions by 1 billion tons till 2030. And it is also trying to reduce the carbon intensity of the economy by over 45% by 2030. And all these 4 will be ultimately summed up as a larger governmental agenda of say achieving net zero by 2070. So this is the target that the government of India is setting, and accordingly the Reserve Bank of India, being the central bank of the country, is also not leaving behind any stone to do whatever in its capacity here. So let us keep all this RBI agenda and the initiatives in mind so that we can write more proper mains answers. Going on to the next article, the Supreme Court right now has taken a very important verdict here. So let us keep this in mind, and while we are writing any answers in GS2 related to the salient features of Representation People of Act, let us keep this case in mind. Now the Supreme Court has directed the Chief Justices of the state high courts, of all the state high courts in India, to form special benches in their court to monitor trials of criminals. Now here, let me take you through some data initially. See, according to the Association for Democratic Reforms and National Electoral Watch, which is a source for this data, according to the latest data, there are around 306 members of parliament who have criminal cases against them. 306 members of parliaments. And among these 306 members of parliaments, 194 members of parliament, or say 25%, have declared serious criminal cases such as murder, kidnapping, crimes against women. So this is a very serious concern, and we have to understand that this is actually present in almost all of the major political parties in India, as we can see here. Now most of these criminal MPs who are say having cases against them are having cases under say Indian Penal Code, under say murder, rape, theft, cheating and so on, under Prevention and Corruption Act, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, Arms Act, Prevention of Damage to Public Property Act. So these are the various acts under which they are having cases against. And here, why this is very important? Because we have to understand these members of parliament are our representatives. They are the representatives of the people. And if the representatives of the people are sent to the parliament, they are sent for making laws. So they are lawmakers. So most of you will be agreeing with me that lawmakers can never be lawbreakers, right? Lawmakers cannot be lawbreakers, and lawbreakers cannot be lawmakers, right? So we have to understand this very important relation, right? So here there are various aspects of disqualification of criminals, let us not forget here, right? While the constitution has some of the cases in which MPs can be disqualified, but it is a representation of the People's Act 1951 which is clearly having various sections related to that. The section 8 is having the grounds on conviction for offences like promoting enmity between two groups, bribery, undue influence, hoarding, profiteering on adulteration of food or drugs, and also some offences under the Dowry Act. So here we have to understand that MPs can be convicted they can be convicted of an offence by a court of law. Only then they can be disqualified. And it is very important to distinguish between just a simple case versus conviction. Till a criminal case is actually investigated and say it is not yet convicted, right? The MP is not, say, disqualified, right? But there is also a case later which you will be seeing, which will be throwing more light on this. Now, the section 8 subclause 3, it is telling that the conviction of a lawmaker for an offence with 2-year sentence or more leads to disqualification of the house. Or say in simple words, if the court is if the court is awarding a sentence of 2 years or more to the MP, that MP is disqualified from the house, right? So the period of disqualification will be minimum of 2 years, or say the amount of quantum of sentence which the court of law has awarded to that particular MP, criminal MP, plus 6 years after release from jail. So minimum of 2 years plus 6 years, till then the MP will be disqualified from holding a place in the legislature, right? Then there was this section 8 subclause 4 which was very controversial. It says that the disqualification takes effect only after 3 months have elapsed from the date of conviction. Say the court of law has convicted of an MP in January. So February, right, March and April. So in May, for example's sake, in May, that MP will be disqualified even after conviction. So the MP will have 3 months to appeal to any higher court of law against that conviction. And if that MP is appealing in that higher court in these 3 months, and if the MP will be able to get a stay order, then the MP will not be, say, disqualified here, right? So the lawmaker could have filed an appeal against the higher court, and that is when this distinction between criminal case and conviction comes into mind. That just having a case and its appeal pending will not be getting you disqualified, right? So this was actually later struck down. This was actually told as unconstitutional in the Lily Thomas case, which will be seen. Now, let us look at the reasons of why this takes place. See, the first is money power. Now we can understand that money makes elections very easy for some candidates, because it becomes very easy for them to influence voters using various, say, free liquor and various other things. Now also there have been various studies apart from this. Say in the US, Thomas Ferguson wrote a book, How Money Drives the US Congressional Elections. He looked at various statistical results at the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. From there, he concluded that there is a straight, or say linear trend of money and elections. So the candidates with higher money that is being spent in the elections, they have higher chance of winning elections. Also in India, we have a separate study. Nilanjan Sarkar, in his work, Money Matters in Indian Elections, Why Parties Depend on Wealthy Candidates, he observed that a wealthier candidate was about 10% more likely to win elections. And also, from the same report that we studied earlier, the ADR report and the National Election Watch report, we can see that 763 MPs of the both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they have an combined worth of how much? Around 30,000 crores, right? We can understand around 7% MPs are billionaires, right? The average MPs, who have assets are around 38.33 crores. Also, we can see the various portfolios, various political parties here. So we can understand most of the MPs in the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, they are quite wealthy, right? So that is the influence of money power. Then also, the second reason is that there is a weak enforcement of law, right? Because there is a nexus between the bureaucrats, the politicians, the police officials. So we have to understand that while there are various provisions against criminal MPs and criminal persons in general, the enforcement of that is not very strong. So that is a very serious issue. And also the various campaigns during election times that is also going on right now. Most of the campaigns are also centered on caste and religion, which also breeds a lot of criminals coming into and say mobilizing vote in the name of caste and religion. Next, political parties are also concerned about the winnability of a political candidate. If a political party is able or say willing to give a ticket to any particular candidate, that political party will be keeping in mind that the candidate must win the election. So the winnability is also very important for that political party and the candidate. And it has been seen that the media image, that the image of the candidate in the media is very important. If the person is having a Robin Hood like figure, right? Most often the media portrays some candidates as Robin Hood figures. So we will be understanding while that person is a criminal, still that person is shown in a very good way in the media. So that is also a way in which these voters are influenced. Then there is also a lack of political parties accountability and transparency, because political parties most often do not say anything about why a particular candidate is selected, what are its background, what are its criteria for contesting in the elections. So the internal democracy of political parties in India is also not that great. So that is why this also takes place. And finally, according to a survey, it was found out that there is extremely low voter awareness in India, right? There is very low awareness about the political candidates, about the manifesto, about the aspirations, about even the total number of political candidates that they are in the particular constituency. Then, according to another survey, people were asked if they want honest MPs or if they want efficient MPs. People went for the efficient MPs while compromising the honest part. We have to understand efficiency is good, but efficiency can also depend on the values of that efficient person. A person can be as efficient as being unethical too. So we have to understand that efficiency and honesty of a political candidate and MP must go hand in hand. But this is running apart from the survey. Now here, the Supreme Court actually took some steps in this direction via various judgments. The very first is about ADR versus Union of India, 2002, when it totally told that the candidates, when it will be saying filing nominations, the criminal antecedents, education qualification, assets must be declared. In the next case, Lily Thomas versus Union of India, the section 8 subclause 4 of the RPA was struck down as unconstitutional because it was against the right to equality under Article 14, because we can understand that 3 months period of say filing an appeal was totally unconstitutional, right? If the person is convicted, that person must be immediately disqualified, and that is what the court told, that the disqualification must be immediate. And this is actually right now. Even recently, a very well-known political candidate and a member of parliament was disqualified due to this. Then in 2017, the Supreme Court observed that there must be special courts in each state to try the pending cases, because there are lots of criminal MPs and the cases pending against them even in the state legislatures. So there must be special courts, and this is a development that took place recently. We will be studying more in the next one. In the PUCL case 2019, the political parties were now prodded. In the ADR case, the political candidates were targeted that they must be disclosing all the information. In the PUCL case, it is the political parties who are being told that you have to publish all the information about your candidates on your website, social media platform, and various leading national newspapers. So right now, before elections, I will be urging you to look for the columns on which the political parties are disclosing the details of their political candidates. So do definitely check it out in the newspapers. Then also the Election Commission of India was encouraged to create a dedicated mobile app for voters where they will be able to check the list of political candidates and the criminal cases pending against them. And finally, in 2021, the Supreme Court also told that no criminal case against any MP or MLA can be withdrawn without an approval of the High Court of the concerned state. So these are all the important judgments that you should be keeping in mind with reference with this matter. And recently, the Supreme Court released guidelines that right now there are many cases against criminal which are pending right now, and even as we can understand that there are some states which are going into election by December, and in the next year we are having the elections at the parliament, at the Lok Sabha. So the Supreme Court is very concerned right now that even in the next Lok Sabha and in the next state assemblies, if criminals again go into the legislature, then the lawmakers will again be the lawbreakers. So the Supreme Court took an immediate and effective stand that the state high courts must be the agencies to monitor all the cases in their respective states. So the power of superintendence under Article 227 above the district judiciary is already under the high courts of particular states. So they must be overseeing all the cases that are going on in the district cases related to the criminals. Then a special bench in each high court must be constituted, which is headed by the Chief Justice of that particular court or comprised of judges assigned by the Chief Justice. Now this special bench, right, they have certain responsibilities. The Chief Justice of High Court, from this bench, they have to register suo motu cases on their own. They have to register the cases against these criminals, right? So they will be also trying to track and monitor these cases. The principal district judges, they have the responsibilities to allocate cases to special designated courts for this matter. Then no adjournments unless in rare or compelling circumstances will be allowed, because it has been seen that these criminal MPs using their skilled lawyers, they tend to adjourn the cases and say attend dates after dates. This is to decrease the delay in these cases. Then this particular bench should also monitor the progress of the trials, and they must be asking information from the principal district judges through status reports and progress of the pending trial proceedings. So right now the Supreme Court is being very, very strict on this matter, and rightfully so. Designated trial courts should give first priority to cases which are more severe in nature, such as punishable with death or life imprisonments, and then for 5-year cases, and then other charges with lesser punishment. So initially the most serious cases are of high concern against MPs, right? Then the state high courts, they must be keeping an independent tab on their websites, official websites, that will be detailing on the district-wide details of various cases which are going on against criminal MPs. So it will be better for the public to be aware and keep track of the cases too. And finally, the Chief Justice of the High Court should be able to list and hear cases in which a lower court had granted a stay in conviction of some MPs. So it will be directly going on to the high courts in this direction. So it is a very welcome step, and I encourage you to do proper attention to these guidelines to write good answers in your mains. In the next article, we'll be trying to understand the recent development between the India and US in their latest 2+2 bilateral visits, where the US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and right now Antony Blinken also visits India for 2+2 ministerial dialogue. Why this is important? Because in GS2 we have various bilateral and regional groupings that is pertaining to India's interests. Now, actually this 2+2 dialogue is being held every year since 2018, when for the first time the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, and the then President of the USA, Donald Trump, started this by replacing the strategic and commercial dialogue. From then, 2+2 was being held every year from 2018. From 2019, India also started the same with Japan. Now, what is this 2+2 dialogue? This is a dialogue between the Minister of External Affairs, or our Foreign Minister, and the Defense Minister of India with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense of the United Nations. So this is the dialogue that these two countries will be doing, because we have to understand India and US has a strategic partnership. Now this strategic partnership is spanning various political, economical, geopolitical arenas that we'll be trying to discuss also. So the main agenda is to enhance this strategic partnership. Now India also has 2+2 dialogues with US and Japan at the same level, which is at the ministerial level. Ministerial level here means both the Minister of External Affairs and the Minister of Defense level, and also with Australia at the Foreign Secretary level only as of now. Now, in this, the potential outcomes that are expected of this should be discussed here. There will be a high-level review of the progress that will be made in these following lines. The very first is addressing the issue of increasingly aggressive China. See, China is right now being very aggressive with its neighbors, with its trade partners, right? And it is trying to be a very assertive force and directly combat the US. So US is very concerned, and also India is also very concerned because of the various activities of China in its neighborhood. So both of them are trying to combat China, placing the Indo-Pacific area in mind, where US is also trying to increase its military presence, and also India is trying to collaborate with various nations such as Australia, Japan, US, right? And also in through various informal groupings such as the quadrilateral dialogue. Next, it is also about defense and security cooperation, because India is yet to acquire around 31 MQ-9B high altitude, high endurance drones that will be, say, imported from the US for military purpose in India. Next, India is also looking forward to manufacture the General Electric F414 jet engines in India that is being shown here. So these are very highly advanced jet engines that will be, say, manufactured in India. And also India is trying to look at various multilateral platforms in which the strategic partnerships can be diversified, and also through various frameworks such as the Quad. So India is increasingly increasing this defense and security cooperation with the US. Next, India is also concerned towards this technological value chain collaboration, especially with reference to artificial intelligence that we are going to discuss in the next one. Next, these two countries are also very concerned with their people-to-people ties with reference to bilateral trade, investment, innovation and job creation, because the two countries share economic interests, share a large amount of diaspora. So they are very important, it is to address these people-to-people ties. And also, other outcomes to be seen here, that Mr. Biden can be the potential chief guest for the Republic Day 2024. Also, this is the very first major visit since the attacks in Israel by Gaza took place, and it is to be seen what is the actual joint stand of India and US on this matter. This is to be seen in the coming day. Now here, the two nations are very particular about their technology equation, particularly the visit right now, because it is coming at a time when artificial intelligence is being developed at a very breakneck speed, and countries such as US, India, China, they are involved in this race. And we have to understand that any country, they must be staying at the top of a technology, because technology of now will be shaping the technology of tomorrow, and that will be shaping the world of tomorrow and the day after and even the next coming decades. So staying on top of any technology is the most important priority of any nation, and also because it will be about the global power structure, because you have to understand AI has the capability, has the potential to totally transform the world. It is making the life easy of various day-to-day life people, the firms and industries, but most importantly for nations, for militaries, AI can be used to enhance military capabilities, right? So it is very important that when military is involved, when technology is involved with military, it can alter the power structure of the world. And also AI has various misuse potential too. So it is also to prevent the dangers of the technology. So these two things are in the minds of both India and US during this 2+2 meeting. Because right now the world is at an AI race, and the US is with an AI race with China. While the US is quite ahead in this race, because China is just also catching up with the US has far more higher amount of say technological capabilities in semiconductors, but China is also fast catching up because Beijing recently announced that it is focusing on intelligentized military. That means military which is not only dependent on information as of now. Information can be in the form of intelligence of what all other countries are doing. Right now China already has achieved superior knowledge in that. Right now China is focusing on making that information more intelligent using technology of artificial intelligence. So it is also trying to transform the PLA, People's Liberation Army, that is the army of China, a world-class armed forces in the next 20 years, and this is the overall broad plan of China. So in response to this, the US released executive order on AI, which was released by Mr. Biden recently. It is about the use of AI in various civilian uses. And also the Pentagon, which is US's Department of Defense, they released this updated strategy for AI adoption by the US armed forces. So with response to Beijing's militarized intelligence, the US also released documents, and right now, while these are very recent ongoings which are going right now, this 2+2 dialogue will be also taking strategy. So the role of India and US in this is that earlier this year, India also signed a very important deal with the US known as the ISAT, or Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, which is a very advanced technological cooperation between India and US. Next, these two nations must be elevating their cooperation in AI to the next level in their bilateral talks. Already we can understand the US Space Force recently has signed research delegation with two Indian startups. And this is the very first time when the US Armed Forces has delegated research projects to Indian startups, or say to any startup in the world. So this is a very interesting development, that the US is actually very keen to look to India for this defense and say artificial intelligence cooperation. And finally, we have to also acknowledge that India has a shortage of scientists, technologies and engineers. But India also has a wide talent pool of youth that can be skilled, and that scaling knowledge, that expertise can be provided by the US. That is to their both advantage. So we have to understand that this 2+2 meet, while it will be focusing very much on defense capabilities, it is also focusing on this technological equation, and it is to be seen that how these two countries navigate the same. So here, the winter session of the parliament is going to run from December 4 to 22. So here, it is very important for prelims because we have to look at the various aspects of parliament and how it functions. So let us look at great detail. So there is a tweet that is coming from Prahlad Joshi. He is announcing that the winter session of 2023 will be conducted from December. And this is the very first time when the session will be for the first time beginning in the new parliament building. So this is a very good news that is coming. And here, when we are coming back to the discussion of this session, according to Article 85 of our Indian Constitution, the President shall from time to time summon each house of the parliament to meet at such time and place as he or she thinks fit. So it is the President who is summoning the parliament, and it will be doing the same here. Now this is a provision that is being borrowed from the Government of India Act of 1935. Because back then, the power to convene a session was with the Governor General of India. Right now, it is with the President, by whose name it is actually convened, right? And actually, the President is not conveying on his own whims and fancies or her own whims and fancies. It is actually a decision which is taken by the Cabinet Committee on Parliamentary Affairs, and actually the outcome or the decision of the outcome here is actually announced by the president. Here there are 10 members including the prime minister which will be deciding the same. The quorum for any session is at least for Rajya Sabha is 25 members and for Lok Sabha it is 55 members. The maximum gap between two sessions as allowed by constitutional standards, it is 6 months. But in India, since we do not have any parliamentary calendar, but we have a convention in India, that there are 3 sessions per year. First, which is the biggest session, that is known as the budget session. Then we have the monsoon session, and finally we have the winter session. So when and when the timing is usually decided by the CCPA, and here it will be announced soon. On the agenda right now, we have 3 bills which will be replacing the Indian Penal Code, the CRPC and the Evidence Act. So this is a very important legislation. The next important legislation will be a bill on the appointment of the CEC and the election commissioners. This is also a very important one, and also as told earlier, this is the very first winter session that will be held in the new parliamentary building from afresh. Looking at the final article, it is about inflation scenario in India, because right now the RBI governor is concerned regarding headline inflation, which is remaining very vulnerable to recurring and overlapping food price shocks. So let us look at this case. But here we have to look at this case from very basics, because UPSC generally will be asking you some important terms with reference to inflation. Such terms as say headline inflation, core inflation, refined core inflation. So let us look at that. See, for policy matters, policymakers generally look at inflation at the 3 levels: headline, core and refined core. Generally, inflation is the persistent rise in prices of goods and services over a period of time, right? So, if we look at the Consumer's Price Index, which is released by the NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation in India, the CPI is actually released by NSO, and if we look at the latest CPI that is available as of September, right, we can understand that there are various items that the NSO use for the calculation of CPI. The items are generally under headers of, if we can zoom properly here, food and beverages, pan and tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, and miscellaneous. So we have these amount of commodities which are measured in the CPI, because these are the things which are used by the people of India across say rural, urban and also all over India in the most frequent manner in a particular month. For example, say Indians generally consume cereals, meat, egg, milk products, right? They use clothing, footwear. They also use various services. Apart from the goods up to this, they also use services such as say health, transportation, recreation, education. So these are the things which are commonly used by the people, right? So these are the various things that are calculated in the CPI. Now we have to understand that all these are the goods and services in total. So headline inflation is actually combining or say calculating the inflation or say the rise in prices in all of these goods and services, right? It is actually taking the CPI combined, right? When it comes to the Monetary Policy Committee in India, it is taking the CPI combined. So that is the headline inflation. Next, when we come to core, we are doing what? We are subtracting some substances from the headline inflation. We are subtracting what? We are subtracting food and beverages, or say we are subtracting also fuel and light, for example, which are volatile substances. Because we can understand food, fuel, these are subjected to various price shocks time and again. There can be a climate disaster and the food prices will be shooting up. There can be a geopolitical crisis such as the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the petroleum prices will be shooting up. So these volatile substances do not actually reflect the actual economic conditions, right? So that is why the Monetary Policy Committee also considers something known as CPI core. CPI core means the overall headline inflation minus the volatile substances of say food and fuel. Now, there is also a recent term which was announced by the Economic Survey which is known as refined core inflation. Now, refined core inflation is excluding even the indirect substances under CPI core inflation which are also volatile in nature. For example, let me give you an example here. See, transportation communication is not actually eliminated in the core inflation. It is included in the core inflation. But if we understand, transportation will be working on what? Petrol. So we can understand fuel is a secondary thing under these headers. So under refined core inflation, we are further seeing that there must not be any volatile components within the subcomponents of this CPI. So we have to understand this CPI core inflation is the most accurate inflation picture of the country. Now, the current scenario according to the RBI governor here is that the CPI is projected to be around at 5.4% for 2023-2024 by the Monetary Policy Committee, which is actually lower than the 6% target, or say the upper target of the Monetary Policy Committee, because inflation targeting is generally in the range of 2% to 6% in India. So if inflation is within that, it is quite within safe limits. Then the governor is also saying that the fallouts of the pandemic, right, the closure of all economic activities and the subsequent opening of all the economic activities, that put a strain on the supply chain all across the world, that increased the prices. And also after the pandemic came the tightening of monetary policies all across the world, especially the US Fed. It started increasing the interest rates, right? And that also led to more and more inflationary fears and subsequently more increase in the interest rates by the US Fed. Also, we have various geopolitical shocks in the form of Russia-Ukraine crisis right now, Israel-Gaza war where that is going on. And also, finally, we are also seeing food inflation in various items such as in dairy items last year, in the tomato prices this year, and also onion prices right now. The food inflation, as we can see here, the weightage of food and beverages is around 45.86 in the overall CPI. So if food inflation rises, overall inflation also rises. So right now the RBI governor is very concerned about the headline inflation in India, and if the food inflation rises, the headline inflation also rises, because the core is excluding volatile substances. The refined is further excluding more and more secondary volatile substances. But the headline inflation is calculating all the substances here. So this was the RBI's general concerns here. So we conclude our discussion here. I thank you for being a very patient audience, and I hope you will do well in your preparation. Thank you.